Welcome to today's video on 4.5 part 3, finding the equation from a graph. We're first going to look at how do we look at a graph and write the equation. So first, we're going to have to identify what type of a graph is it. Is it a sine and cosine graph? Is it a cosecant, secant graph? Is it a tangent, cotangent graph from the shape? So here in the first part, I've given you the different shapes here to look at. So if you go down to the bottom here, there's an example of a graph. So the first thing we want to do is identify what kind of graph this is. And from looking at this graph, we can tell with the end and then an asymptote and then another asymptote. And then, so the two asymptotes are in the middle. This is not an asymptote. This is where the y-axis would go to, and this is where the x-axis would go to, which will help you to look at the vertical and horizontal shift. So the green part here are just the asymptotes. So with the two asymptotes here, we can tell that this is a secant graph as opposed to a cosecant. So we know that this is y equals a secant b times x plus p plus d. So now we got to figure out, well, what are all these terms? So the second thing it says is determine a. And like it gives you different examples. So for secant and cosecant, we want to take the local max minus the local min and divide it by 2. Because basically, if you're looking at this is a cosine graph. So notice you would take the top and the bottom, or in this case, the top and the bottom, subtract them and multiply and divide by 2. So the top here is 0. The bottom is -1. So that's equal to 1. Divided by 2 means a is equal to 1/2. Then to find your period. So the period here, basically for secant, you're just going to take 2 pi and divide it by the x max minus the x min. So the x maximum here, the largest x value is 3 pi over 2. The smallest x value is negative pi over 2. So you take 2 pi divided by, well, 3 pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is 4 pi over 2, which is the same as 2 pi, which means that b is equal to 1, which means there is not a horizontal stretch or shrink, because that means the period here is 2 pi. Now, to find the p term, the phase shift. So you're going to take, for secant, you're going to take the opposite of the x minimum, because normally the cosine graph starts at 0. So that means it's shifted to the left pi over 2. So it's going to be the opposite of negative pi over 2, which means that it's equal to positive pi over 2. And then the vertical shift, you want to examine the graph and determine how far up or down the graph has shifted by looking at the original x-intercepts of the base function and how they've shifted. Meaning normally cosine, right, this point at 0 should be up here, but it is now at -1/2. So that means that your vertical shift is down 1/2. So if we're looking at this, our function would be y equals 1/2 secant there's no b term, so it's just going to be x plus pi over 2, because that's our p, minus 1/2. Now the other thing we have to determine is there a reflection? Is this a reflection? Now normally cosine or secant, normally like the cosine, it would go down then up. This is going up then down, so that means there was a reflection here, so we have to put a negative sign in front of the 1/2. All right, so let's look at the next one. This one's a little easier because this is either a sine or cosine curve. And in this case, because it starts and goes up and then down and then back up again, this is a sine curve. So now we got to fill in for what the shifts are. And this is where it comes into play that it's nice to have the dotted lines. So, first of all, the amplitude, the A, the top is 4, the bottom is -2. So you go 4 minus -2 divided by 2. So 6 divided by 2 is 3. So that means A is equal to 3. For the B term, you're going to take 2 pi and divide it by 3 pi over 2 minus pi over 2, because that's how long this is. So it's 2 pi divided by pi, because the period of this function is pi. So what number does b have to be in order for the period to be pi? It has to be 2. Then you're going to find out, well, what is the phase shift? And the phase shift here, if you notice, it's the opposite of the x minimum. In this case, the phase shift, it would be negative pi over 2. And then we're going to have the vertical shift, and notice the dotted line here tells you that these points that were at 0, because normally the sine curve starts at 0, it's now at 1, so that means it went up 1. And notice that sine normally starts and goes up and then down, so there's no reflection, so there's no need for a negative sign. So it's going to be y equals 3 sine 2 times x minus pi over 2 plus 1. That is our function for this sine curve. All right, I hope this video has helped you, and I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I will see you guys next class.